Jordan Peterson, somebody I know many of you listening and watching this are a fan of. I'm a fan of him myself. I'm sure Ben is. He is a living legend. Dr. Peterson, he's been very big in the intellectual dark web space, in the heterodox coalition space, the resistance to the woke orthodoxy, you name it, he's been a part of it for the past, 6 years or so. He was banned from Twitter, at first indefinitely, and it appears to have been temporarily, a little while back, a couple of weeks ago, for tweeting out, "Remember when pride was a sin and Ellen Page just had her breasts removed by a criminal physician?" That's the exact text of the tweet that got him banned. Initially, Twitter gave him the opportunity, as they often do, to remove the tweet in order to end his suspension. And he didn't do that, didn't want to do that. And eventually Twitter simply removed it themselves, and then it appears they ended his ban. So it turned into a temporary ban, and they removed the tweet, which supposedly violated their rules. Peterson, one of the things I want to talk about with this is that we've seen people get banned from Twitter before. We haven't seen Jordan Peterson get banned from Twitter before. And Peterson is, a very mainstream figure. He's not very close to, say, like Alex Jones on the political spectrum, or the spectrum of provocation, if you will, provocativeness. And the other thing is that Peterson released something like a 15-minute statement about his ban, in which he appears to be reading off of a teleprompter, and he is pissed. He is more pissed than I have ever seen him. I know that for a few years now, since his dependency issues and his wife's cancer diagnosis, which I think thankfully ended up not turning into anything terminal, since that very stressful time, he does seem to have become more erratic and impulsive and somewhat petty at times, especially on Twitter. I mean, a couple months back, there was a situation where he was talking about essentially fat acceptance, because there was some fat model on Sports Illustrated or something, and he did it in a kind of weird way, and it got him a lot of flack, and it was unusual for him to talk about it in the way he was talking about it. This Elliot Page tweet, or Ellen Page, that's what Peterson called her, that I don't find it particularly objectionable, and I don't think he should have been banned for it. But his response to it, and I'm going to try to link the video for anyone who hasn't seen it down below. The response to it from Peterson was quite bizarre. And I think there's a few reasons for this. One is that, again, he appears to be reading off of a teleprompter, which doesn't work very well when you're angry, when you're like righteously indignant and angry. And also, Peterson he's built his brand on being this very thoughtful, contemplative, intellectual guy who is also very calm and sober and is kind of a soothing balm on the culture war. I mean, his argument has always been that he's taken as many people away from the radical right as he has from the radical left. And I do believe him when he says that. He doesn't wear anger very well, from what I understand. I think, and part of it is his voice is just it's this famously folksy Canadian Kermit the Frog sounding voice, and it's also quite high pitched. It almost reminds me of like Daniel Day-Lewis as Abraham Lincoln in the movie Lincoln. It's got this like weird kind of high pitched quality to it, and it's very folksy and it's very charming, but it does not sound great when he is angry. It sounds very odd. So a combination of factors has made me not take particularly well to Peterson's response. Ben, I don't know how you felt about it, but I wanted to discuss this topic in two ways. One is talking about the problem itself, which to start with was that people are getting banned for saying the type of stuff Peterson said, which I actually don't think is outside the realm of mainstream opinion. A lot of people are not a fan of these elective mastectomies that people like Elliot Page are getting. I'm not a fan of them. But Peterson's response to it cannot be ignored, because it kind of has become bigger than the actual ban itself. I mean, it climaxes in its ridiculousness when he says, and I quote, "Up yours, woke moralists. We'll see who cancels who," which is a real thing that you can find Jordan Peterson saying on the internet. Ben, what the hell do we make of all this?
So first, when I first read the tweet, I kind of didn't understand it. It seemed like he was kind of saying that any elective surgery is a manifestation of the pride of sin. I mean, or the sin of pride. I know his objection to kind of the more trans radicalism. So it was a bit confusing. So I was surprised he got banned for that. But I share some of your thoughts in the beginning, and I'm not sure how accurate this characterization is, but it seems like Peterson was sort of involuntarily thrust into the culture wars. He was, and I know he would object to this term, but he was somewhat of a victim hero. I mean, he was to be subject to an anti-free speech, compulsory speech law, Bill C-16, if I remember correctly, which required the use of preferred pronouns under some civil or criminal penalty. So, to my mind, he was rightly objecting to compelled speech. I don't know what Canada's free speech protections are, but almost nowhere has what we have under the First Amendment.
They're not great.
Yeah. But now, instead of being some type of involuntary conscript into the culture wars, he appears to have donned the body armor and taken up his rhetorical AR-15. And I actually wrote down that exact same quote that you just read, Scott, this "up yours, woke moralist, we'll see who cancels who." I mean, he's fully engaged in the battle now. And one thing I think he did in this video that really did him no favors is if the left wanted to portray him as a villain, I mean, he had the look and tone of anything you could call a victim. You know, bespoke suit and a leather chair, condescendingly reciting their positions and paraphrasing them. I mean, he gave them a pretty villainy looking video to point to if they wanted to make him seem like that.
Yeah, and that's something he had avoided for the better part of 6 years since he was thrust into the spotlight in 2016. He had Lex Luthor. That's the name of the Superman villain. I was trying to remember, like he was giving me like terrible like comic book movie villain vibes in that video. As someone who tried to watch the video from a kind of neutral perspective, I love Jordan Peterson for what it's worth. I want the audience to know that I'm a huge fan of his. He's one of the few public figures I truly admire, and so everything I say about him really comes from a place of deep respect, admiration, and love. I mean, I really, really love this guy. But yeah, this video it's not gonna go away for quite a while. I mean, that moment where he's like, "Up yours, woke moralists, we'll see who cancels who," is simultaneously, it's shockingly inarticulate for one of the most articulate public intellectuals that I know of. It's hard to tell exactly what he's even saying there or why he's saying it in the way that he's saying it. And it sounds much more like something that like Milo Yiannopoulos would have said maybe 5 years ago. Because Milo Yiannopoulos was a much more provocative and incendiary figure, and inevitably Milo Yiannopoulos imploded very quickly. He had a very, very bright but very, very short burn. Peterson has had much more longevity because he has been so precise with his speech. What is one of the 12 rules for life? Be precise in your speech. "Up yours, woke moralists, we'll see who cancels who" is not a very precise statement in more than one way. And there are several places in the video that are like this, and it's also kind of a wonder why it was 15 minutes long. That seems too long for this type of response. I mean, it's in regards to a 2-sentence tweet, which again, the tweet itself is sort of odd and a little difficult to understand. And I agree with you there, Ben. The whole situation makes me worry about Peterson because he is such a vital figure. And I think he is someone that cannot be allowed to be caricatured and turned into a villain because he's not. He's a very important person, and I truly believe a very good person. Again, one of very few, I have very few public figures that I look up to, frankly, at this point. I have maybe 3, and one of them is Jordan Peterson. Somebody that I do not know personally, that I still care about, that I have that sort of parasocial relationship with. There's lots of stuff on the internet about people in their parasocial relationships. I try to avoid that type of thing. With Peterson, I do kind of have that. And I understand his anger and his irritation because I don't think he should have been banned. And yet I feel like of much bigger concern to me right now. I mean, I have 2 concerns. One, again, is that Peterson was banned. He should not have been banned. I understand why he's irritated that he was banned. And I understand that he wanted to be defiant in the face of his ban. That was all fine and stuff that he should have done. But man, did he go about it in just a baffling way.
Yeah, I'm with you. I get Peterson's position. I mean, he spent the better part of a decade, I mean, even a career really, trying to provide insight about the banality of evil, about the horrors of collectivism, points that I definitely share. But this seems like giving up on that endeavor and instead ready to join a side and pick up arms, and not only to join a side and pick up arms, but to do so in a 15-minute long, highly produced, it seemed to me, video against a bird app. That just seems so disproportionate. It's not the best word right now, but it does seem a little, maybe petty's the word. It seems to me, but I think maybe it's the problem here is, do you think that he's given up on the endeavor of the marketplace of ideas, dialogue, and that it's just not worth it anymore? Because you can say something as almost, again, I'm saying I barely understood his point to this tweet. Is he given up on that way of going about it and ready to pick up the fight, especially in the context of him becoming exclusive, I think, with Daily Wire Plus, which is Ben Shapiro's outlet? Yeah,
which is something that it's going to give him this reputation of being more explicitly right-wing, because the Daily Wire is explicitly right-wing, to be fair. Ben Shapiro is one of the few members of the intellectual dark web, which may or may not exist depending on who you ask, but he's one of the few members who ever was explicitly right-wing. Most of them actually were quite explicitly left-wing, or switched at one point like Dave Rubin did. But on that note, what you're saying about this sort of giving up on or being worn down to the point of losing some of the nuance and the desire to sort of reach across the aisle and actually be convincing and persuasive rather than just sort of using talking points as a blunt object to hit your opponents with ideologically. This is something that I think it's starting to hit Peterson, and I've seen it hit other figures in that sort of space, that sort of IDW, for lack of a better term, again, space. It definitely happened to Dave Rubin, I think. I have a theory with Dave Rubin, who is somebody who went from a person that at one point he was on my list of one of the few public figures I really admired. He was a huge part of my political awakening. I'd love to have him on the show. I still appreciate what he did for me immensely, because him and Peterson were kind of the two primary figures in my political awakening in 2017. But Rubin, it seemed to, circa 2019, he, I think, started to see that the Democratic Party was not going to wake up. I think that was his original goal. And is the original goal of many of the people in that space was like, let's wake up the liberals and the Democrats to what is happening on the left. And they were hoping that when the 2020 primaries started, which was in 2019 for president, that they would see candidates emerging just who kind of understood that wokeness was an issue. And that candidate, I guess you had Tulsi Gabbard and Andrew Yang, who went nowhere in the primary. And other than that, nothing really happened. And to me, the climax of Dave Rubin's journey was when Pete Buttigieg was about to go on to his show. A lot of people don't remember this. This was a very small flashpoint in this sort of culture wars of the past few years. But I always say that Dave Rubin was pretty good and was a pretty nuanced guy who I greatly admired and still appreciate on some level for what he did for me. But he had this moment where he was about to have like this big breakthrough. He was going to have one of the front runner candidates, Pete Buttigieg, on his show. On Twitter, he was in the process of like tweeting at his Pete Buttigieg's campaign team, and they were saying like, DM us, let's get this scheduled. Mm-hmm. And of course, the Democratic activist class informed the Buttigieg team that Dave Rubin was a terrible Nazi white supremacist. The gay Jewish kind, the rarest of kinds, but still Nazi white supremacist. And that interview was canned immediately. And I think that broke Dave. I think that Dave felt like after so much hardship and having a hard time breaking through into that space and being a figure that could go there and say, hey guys, we got to wake up. We got to fix the Democratic Party and the liberal side. I think that in that moment, he was like, fuck this. He was like, if I can't even get someone on my show without people saying, oh, I'm a white supremacist Nazi, and I'm just about to have one of the front runners on my show. And also they both happen to be gay men, and I don't know if maybe we're going to discuss that. It seemed like it would be a really interesting interview. Mm-hmm. I was excited for it, and I remember being kind of pissed at what happened. And I think that was the moment that Dave started to just nosedive in terms of his ability to maintain the nuance that made him such an interesting figure politically from 2014 to 2019. I really do think he was an important voice, not quite as much anymore. Although, Dave, if you happen to be hearing this, I'd love to have you on the show to discuss it. But to bring it back to Peterson, I think that we're seeing this sort of journey finally hit Peterson. This has happened to many people. I think it might have happened to Brett Weinstein a little bit. I think that it's happened to a lot of figures that start off very nuanced, very reasonable, very interested in sort of compromise and healing of the divide between the woke left and the liberal left, and to some extent the right. But that attitude, rightfully, maybe not entirely rightfully, but understandably, that attitude dissipates after they are subjected to so much hardship in those efforts on that mission. Because, like, again, with Rubin, he had a moment after the Pete Buttigieg thing where I think he was just like, you know what, fuck it, they're not going to listen to me. Yeah. So now I'm just going to kind of, start having Donald Trump and Ted Cruz on the show and ruining a lot of these relationships. He became a huge Candace Owens stan. And so I think that we're seeing something like that happen to Peterson, where he is exhausted. He doesn't, I think, see the path to victory as clearly as he once did for Western, liberal democratic society. And I get it. I have felt that same level of exhaustion. It's turned me into somewhat of a more aggressive figure in this fight as well. But it's a little sad to see.
Do you think that's justified? I mean, in the sense of, if you can't see that way forward, if you know that you're we call it the culture war. If you know you're in battle, I mean, I don't know what I don't want to say moral. Like, is that what you're supposed to do? Are you supposed to go after the enemy? Or are you supposed to try to still philosophize on one side and reach out? Like, we've used the term culture war, and it's probably a bad one because it does pit people against each other. But I got to say, the way the left has acted over the last 10 years, there's no way not to think like that. When the threat of cancellation can come to someone who's on an airplane and tweets a bad joke, Justine Sacco, I think was her name, gets off the plane and she's fired. Like, when it's gotten to that point, do you have to take that posture? I mean, who's out there still able to say they aren't on one side of the battle lines?
Yeah, I like this question a lot, Ben, and I think that it's one of the most important questions for the sort of heterodox coalition is, like, how do we respond to the fact that it doesn't look like we're going to logic and reason and compromise our way out of this? And I think that is the lesson Dave Rubin learned. That is the lesson Jordan Peterson learned. Now, the way we respond to learning that lesson is important, though, because I do think it is valid to say at this point we are, for a little while, I also thought maybe let's just logic and reason and compromise our way out of this. Let's conversation our way out of this. Let's have endless conversations with these people until they finally wake up, and then the birds will be singing once again in America. It'll be morning in America, and everything will be back to normal. That is not going to happen. June of 2020 was my moment where I went like, no. Like, the George Floyd riots is when the George Floyd racial reckoning meltdown is when I said that is not an option. This is a dog fight now. It's a street fight now.